You are listening to Chapter 2, Lesson 7 of Form 3 African History. Cameroon General Education. Narrated by Wacheseh Academy. The First World War and its impact on Africa. Reasons for African involvement. To make the Germans fight the Allied powers on many fronts including Africa, in other they could easily be defeated. The Allied powers needed African human and material resources to fight against the Central Powers. To stop the Germans from making use of resources in their protectorate against the Allied powers. The Allied powers needed African naval bases, especially the Atlantic ports, to defeat the Germans and prevent the Germans from making use of her African ports such as Douala in Cameroon, Lomo in Togoland, etc., against the Allied. To prevent the Germans from seizing their African colonies. Britain and France had the territorial ambition of annexing German African colonies. France wanted to revenge for the humiliation suffered from the Germans in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71. The ambition of Britain and France to build their empire using German territories influenced them to extend the war to Africa to defeat the German. Britain and France wanted to make economic gains from the German protectorate. Raw materials, mineral, market, etc. The Allied powers wanted to defeat the Germans and capture their African protectorate and use them as bargaining power after the war in the peace settlement with the Germans. The European strategy to save Europe from more human and material destruction influenced them to spread the war outside Europe. How the war was fought in Africa. The British and the French colonial forces invaded and chased the Germans out of Togoland. In Cameroon, the West African Expeditionary Force, led by General Dobel, fought the Germans from August 1914 and defeated them in February 1916. The South African forces chased the Germans out of Southwest Africa and occupied the territory. The war was briefly fought in southern Angola between the Portuguese colonial forces, and the Germans were defeated. The longest conflict was in German East Africa. The South African forces, joined by Tuesday British East and West African troops, fought the Germans until they defeated them in 1918. Role played by the Africans. They served as fighters. Over 1 million African troops were recruited. They served as carriers. They helped in the transportation of European war materials, food, etc. Africa supplied European industries with a lot of raw materials, for example oil palm, kennel. African villages served as military camps, their rivers as ports, provided naval bases, and airfields provided air bases in the war. They contributed financially to the war. Europeans increased taxes, especially for European products, during the war. African troops were very instrumental in putting down the various revolts against colonial authorities. They provided Europeans with a labor force. Positive effects. Sociopolitical. It led to a mass exodus of European administrative and commercial personnel to serve in the Western Front or war campaigns elsewhere. In the Borgu division in northern Nigeria, there was no single European administrator during the war period. It provided an opportunity for Africans to watch Europeans fighting each other, and this made Africans no longer respect the Europeans. Allied forces encouraged Africans to kill the white German settlers as enemies. This made Africans courageous not only to fight the Germans, but other European powers. It made Africans gain more knowledge of the outside world. It brought Africans in contact with European ideas of liberty and freedom. The war stimulated the African elite to demand compensation for loyalty to the colonial master. For example, in Algeria, it brought to an end the harsh German colonial rule in her African protectorates. It led to the Paris Peace Conference, in which President Wilson of the USA insisted on the principle of self-determination. It contributed to the organization of the Pan-African Congress in Paris to coincide with the Paris Peace Conference in order for Pan-African leaders like Webb Du Bois to press the importance of Africa in the future world. Economic. The war provided job opportunities to over 1% of the African popularity in war work. Many poor Egyptian peasants offered their services to the British Army in the war against the Turks in the Middle East, in return gained better wages. Many African soldiers and carriers returned from the war with money. The war led to an economic boom in those products needed by the Allied powers. It encouraged the development of import substitute industries. The war introduced more motor vehicles to ease the movement of Allied forces. This led to the development of many memorable roads and bridges. It led to the rapid development of ports like Mombasa, Port Harcourt, etc. for Allied ships to easily anchor with supplies. The war led to a large influx of European troops to Egypt. Negative effects. Social-political. The Wacheseh campaign caused severe hardship to the rural peoples. The villages were often burnt and food supplies seized by opposing armies. The war caused severe human destruction as many Africans died of diseases, malnutrition, and overwork. Many Africans were killed in action fighting in the Western European front. The war led to a mass exodus of European administrators and commercial personnel, and this caused a slow down, at times complete stoppage of many essential services manned by Europeans. The war influenced the British to increase the power of traditional rulers under the indirect rule system in order for the traditional rulers to easily recruit fighters and carriers for the British. The French West Africa administrator wildly used indignat on those who refused to be conscript into the army. They were flogged and even hanged. After the defeat of the Germans, the protectorates were lost to new administrating powers without consulting the colonial people. It made some German protectorate to be partitioned like Togo land and Cameroon between the British and French. The war retarded the development of social services like education, health, in the German protectorate were a strong sickness improvement of hygiene and sanitation. Economic. Increase in government the economy such as price control, requisition of crops, and livestock. It led to the conscription of labor for essential colonial projects, and the mass recruitment of Africans to serve as carriers and soldiers coupled with the influenza epidemic led to the death of many Africans, and that led to labor shortage to work on African farms. The war caused economic hardship because of a shortage of products. Price increased to about 50% in countries like Togoland, Tanganyika. The war led to the expulsion of German nationals and the seizure of their plantations and commercial houses and factories by the occupying powers. Public works came to a halt in many African countries because of the decline in government revenue on duties on imported goods.